On the morning of May 6, 1875, a bridge watchman at the portage crossing of the Genesee River Gorge in western New York saw smoke rising from the timber below the deck just before 7 a.m. Within an hour, the upper framing was fully involved. By 8, 234 feet of the highest wooden railroad bridge in the United States was burning end to end above a gorge the river had spent 10,000 years cutting. By noon, it was gone. What fell into that gorge wasn't just a bridge. It was the only crossing of the Genesee on the Erie Railroad's entire main line between New York City and Chicago. Every westbound and eastbound freight car had to cross it. And with it gone, neither direction was possible. The Erie's general manager asked his engineers one question that morning: how long to rebuild? The answer was 100 days, if absolutely everything went right. He told them to begin. What followed is one of the fastest major bridge reconstructions in American railroad history, and one of the least documented. The men who rebuilt the Portage Bridge that summer left almost nothing behind in writing. What they built is still standing. Freight trains cross it today. To understand what burned, you need to understand why it existed there at all. The Erie's route through central New York had no easy options. The river valleys cutting south through the Allegheny Plateau were a sequence of obstacles. 19th century engineers simply had to solve one at a time. At the village of Portageville, the Genesee Gorge measured 234 feet deep, roughly 818 feet rim to rim. There was no way around it a locomotive of the 1850s could manage. The engineer assigned to the crossing was Silas Seymour. Working for a railroad that in 1851 had no money to spare, chartered, restarted, and refinanced multiple times, running on a schedule that left no room for an expensive masonry structure like the one being built at Staruka Creek in Pennsylvania around the same time. Seymour's answer was timber, a trestle built from stacked timber bents rising from stone footings on the gorge floor and on ledges cut into its walls, carrying cap timbers, stringers, deck, and rail. When it opened in 1852, no wooden railroad bridge in America carried trains higher off the ground. The men who built it were Irish immigrants from the famine years, most with no prior railroad construction experience, earning $1 to $1.25 a day for common labor, $1.75 to $2 for skilled timber framers. There was no premium for working 200 feet up a bent tower rather than at the base. A man worked wherever the foreman put him because he needed the wages. Surviving accident notices from local newspapers sometimes named the dead and sometimes didn't. The payroll ledgers show what payroll ledgers from this era always show: a name present one week, gone the next, with no explanation of whether the man moved on, was injured, or died. That bridge stood 23 years. What finally destroyed it wasn't age or overload, it was sparks. A locomotive crossing on the morning of May 6, 1875, shed embers into dry timber framing below the deck, and the fire spread through a structure where every single member was fuel. The Erie's response was immediate. Because it had no choice, no alternate crossing existed, and the entire western operation was severed for as long as the gorge stayed open. The board authorized rebuilding within days, this time in iron. A Pratt through truss, fabricated by the Edgemore Iron Company of Wilmington, Delaware, and erected in the field by the Erie's own construction department. The target was 100 days, exactly what the math required to stop the financial bleeding, and not a day more. The workforce assembled from several directions at once. Erie maintenance crews redirected from elsewhere on the line. Ironworkers Edgemore pulled in from other projects. Stonemasons hired through labor agents in Buffalo and Rochester to repair fire-damaged piers, and common laborers hired locally and brought in by rail. Surviving payroll records show a workforce predominantly Irish in common labor, Scottish and English in the specialist iron trades, and German-born in masonry repair, reflecting exactly the immigration patterns Western New York had been absorbing since the Canal era. Common labor paid about $1.50 a day for 10 hours. A skilled riveter working the hot rivet gangs could earn $2.50 to $3, near the top of the era's construction wage scale, a direct reflection of exactly how dangerous that specific job actually was. If a story like this is worth your time, subscribing helps make sure more of them find their way to you. The riveting process deserves real detail, because it sat at the absolute center of iron bridge construction, and because the men who did it are almost entirely missing from the record. Every joint in a Pratt truss, angle iron, plate iron, channel sections, was locked together by driving a hot iron rivet through drilled holes and hammering its protruding end into a second head. This ran entirely by hand, organized into four-man gangs. The heater tended a portable forge, judging correct rivet temperature purely by color, orange approaching white, learned only through the experience of getting it wrong. The second man pulled the glowing rivet with long tongs and threw it to the catcher, who received it in a metal cup at the connection point. Missed that throw, and a white-hot rivet fell however far the structure happened to be off the ground. The bucker-up pressed a heavy backing tool against the rivet's factory head, while the riveter hammered the other end into shape, the whole sequence taking roughly 30 seconds when a gang worked in rhythm, closing 150 to 250 rivets a day across the bridge's full 818-foot length. Total rivets required ran into the tens of thousands, every single one thrown, caught, and hammered by hand at heights running from 30 feet up to over 200 feet above the river, with no net, no harness, nothing beneath a man who missed a catch except the same 234-foot drop the rivet itself would take. Before any of that ironwork could start, the gorge itself had to be made safe. Fire had potentially damaged the surviving stone piers in ways that don't always show on the surface. Heat entering stone and mortar creates internal fractures percussion testing can miss entirely. Assessment crews went in within 48 hours of the fire being extinguished, working around timber debris still smoldering at its core 3 days later, to determine which piers could bear the new iron load and which needed repair first. Then came false work, the temporary timber structure supporting iron members during erection, since a Pratt truss has zero structural integrity until every connection is complete. Timber framers built this upward from the pier footings and staging set against the gorge walls, doing work physically identical to what had built the original 1852 bridge, except now it would be torn down the moment the permanent iron structure no longer needed it. It was considered less skilled purely because the material was wood instead of iron. Purely economic distinction that had nothing to do with the actual danger of the job. Picture the gorge. At the height of construction in July 1875, 3 separate operations running simultaneously at 3 different elevations. At the bottom, masons finishing repair courses on stone piers. At mid-height, timber framers completing falsework bays. At the top, iron gangs setting the first truss members on completed spans, forge fires burning orange against gray stone. The constant sound of hammers on rivets echoing off the gorge walls so loudly that voice communication. Beyond 10 feet was essentially impossible. Men, coordinated entirely through hand signals, and the kind of instinctive rhythm that only comes from doing identical work together long enough that it becomes automatic. Surviving records don't give a complete account of injuries or deaths across those 100 days. Local newspapers sometimes named men, sometimes just noted an accident with no name attached at all. There was no accident reporting requirement, no workers' compensation, and the legal doctrine of assumed risk held exactly as firmly in 1875 as it had in 1851. A man who took a dangerous job had implicitly accepted its dangers, and the railroad owed him nothing beyond wages for days actually worked. An injured man was simply a line that stopped appearing in the ledger. A dead man was a vacancy on the following week's roster. The 100th day fell in late August 1875. The first revenue train crossed the completed iron bridge without incident. The Erie's annual report noted the fire and the superior replacement structure. Trade press covered the truss specifications, the tonnage, the fabrication timeline at Edgemoor's works, and named every engineer involved. The iron workers who threw hot rivets to each other 200 feet above the Genesee are not named anywhere in those accounts. Neither are the timber framers, the masons, or the common laborers who moved material and mixed mortar. They exist only in payroll ledgers, under first names or bare initials, next to dollar figures representing 10 hours of work in a gorge, under conditions that wouldn't be legally permitted today and weren't questioned in 1875 because nobody with the authority to question them was ever required to. Hold 2 things at once here. First, what was actually accomplished: a bridge 818 feet long and 234 feet above a river, fabricated off-site, shipped by rail, hauled by wagon, and erected on fire-damaged piers that had to be assessed and repaired first. Completed in 100 days, in a gorge so loud with rivet hammers that men couldn't talk to each other, by crews working from timber falsework at heights that offered no recovery from a fall. Second, the actual conditions under which it happened: $1.50 a day, No fall protection beyond a man's own caution, no nearby medical facility, no meaningful accident reporting, and in many cases, simply no name ever written down at all, because the form had no column for one. The Iron Portage Bridge stands today inside Letchworth State Park, one of the most visited parks in New York State, above a gorge often called the Grand Canyon of the East. Freight trains still cross it regularly, carrying loads the original Erie locomotives would never have recognized as physically possible. The engineers are in the trade press. The railroad executives are in the annual reports. The men who threw hot iron to each other across open air 200 feet above the Genesee River in the summer of 1875 are in neither. They built it in 100 days. It's been carrying trains for 150 years. The river doesn't register any difference between the years men were working in that gorge and all the years since when they weren't. The iron is still there. The rivet heads are smooth and cold now. Someone drove every one of them in by hand in 100 days, in a gorge 234 feet deep.